Interestingly, the first lesson was a more general one, just discussing the life of King Solomon, the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. In our next lesson, we'll talk about the authorship. There's some challenges as to whether Solomon wrote it or not. We think he did. There are people who doubt that or try to criticize that conclusion. We'll talk about that next time. But we're going to start this study on the given assumption, I think the accurate assumption, that Solomon is the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. And so this first lesson is just a little bit of background about his life, to know a little bit about him more particularly, so that we can maybe understand something about his mindset when he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And so the first lesson starts out by asking, when Solomon became king, what did God offer him? We're going to be looking in 1 Kings. All of these questions, the answers are going to come from the first several chapters of 1 Kings. So in 1 Kings chapter 3 at verse 5, in Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give thee." Isn't that incredible to imagine that the God of heaven, the almighty creator of all things, says, "Ask what you want and I'll give it to you"? Wouldn't that just make your mind race concerning the possibilities of things that you could ask for? And of course, asking with the understanding that the one who has offered this has complete power to make it so. And so that's an amazing thing, what God offered to Solomon. And then you gotta go on to say what Solomon asked for was also incredibly amazing. Keep reading there at verse 6. And Solomon said, "Thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in. And thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people?" And so, again, it's just really amazing that Solomon would ask for that. When he could ask for literally anything he wanted, he asked for that. So basically, he asked for wisdom. And in a way, you'd have to say he was already wise. It was an amazingly wise thing for him to ask for wisdom. And so I would argue that before he was even granted great wisdom from God, he already was demonstrating wisdom in regards to what he asked for. And then, of course, keep reading there, and we see what God granted him. Verse 10. I'm in 1 Kings 3, verse 10. And the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said unto him, "Because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment, behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if thou wilt walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments as thy father David did, then will I lengthen thy days." All right, so God could anticipate what most people would ask for. And he mentions it there in verse 11. You've not asked long life, riches, nor revenge on your enemies. And don't you think that is probably a pretty good listing of the things that most people would ask for? Given this opportunity, you can have whatever you want. Solomon didn't ask for that. He asked for an understanding heart, wisdom to judge God's people. And that request pleased God. And so he said, "I'm going to give you that. And I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for too. I'm going to give you riches, so that no one will compare to you in riches." And we think that that's probably true. I've done some reading, different ones people trying to analyze the wealth of Solomon versus the wealth of really rich people in our day and time. It's hard. It's really hard to draw a one-to-one parallel and be able to say absolutely. But I think there's a very legitimate chance that Solomon is the richest man that ever lived in the history of time. And so what God said he would give him, he certainly gave it to him. And how that would rank among others in history, my thinking is, although there are people who would argue back and forth about it, my thinking is Solomon very likely was the richest man who ever lived. And he says, if you maintain faithfulness, I'll also lengthen your days. I'll give you long life. Now, I have a question about verse 12. I've given thee a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither shall after thee shall any arise like unto thee. So he's going to give him wisdom and understanding. And do you have a problem with that? Is there a potential issue? I'm thinking of one person specifically who came after him. Would you say that Solomon was wiser than Jesus? He said, I give thee a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. Was Solomon wiser than Jesus? Monty?
I would say no, because Jesus was involved in creation and all the stuff that we're just discovering now, like DNA and nuclear things and this and that. God and Jesus in creation set all that up at the beginning. We just now figuring out those things. So I would say that would be Jesus would be an exception to that, and he may have just been referring to kings. There won't be another king like you. So, but however we understand it, we have to understand that Jesus had to know more and been wiser than Solomon.
I think that's right. And I think you are right. In other words, among the kings who will arise, there wasn't one like you before, and there won't be one after. In fact, he even says that in verse 13. Thou hast not asked, but I will give thee both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And so I do think that he's specifically comparing what he's going to give to Solomon in all regards, wisdom, wealth, and so forth, that there'd be no comparison among any kings. James?
That might be a problem for Jesus as a king too,
but not a physical king. Yeah.
that way he was born, but he was special, he was a man of God.
Yeah. Yeah, Jesus is certainly a unique individual in that sense. And James says, so you could, any way you want to explain it, you could exclude Jesus from that listing because he is unique among all who were ever born. And I think that's true. So again, I don't think we have to be worried that we got some kind of a false statement or contradictory claim there about Solomon. Okay, the text goes on, and we will not take time to read the rest of the chapter, but the text goes on to describe the very famous first demonstration of Solomon's wisdom. And you know the story, I think, very well. We even practice it with our kids in the Bible drill class. You know, two women came to Solomon with one live baby. And the situation as described was that they both had a newborn baby, and one mother had rolled over on her baby in the bed and smothered it, and so she took her dead baby and put it with the other mother, took that live baby and brought it to herself. And so in the morning when they arose, there was this great argument about whose is the living baby. And you know, I think we know the story, we know how it turned out. But I mean, if not knowing this story and you were addressed with this argument, this conflict, how in the world am I supposed to figure that out? How in the world would I be able to tell this is her baby, that's her baby? How am I supposed to know? But Solomon, of course, came up with the perfect solution to the problem. And he ordered one of his soldiers to take a sword and cut the baby in half and give half to each mother. And he knew that the true mother have such natural devoted affection for her child. She said, no. And as soon as the mother did that, he knew that she was the true mother. And of course the child was hers. It says that the report of this demonstration of power, notice the very last verse in chapter 3, this demonstration of his wisdom. All Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do just judgment. And so, it doesn't say, and you couldn't prove, that this was a providential development that just almost immediately the first thing that comes before him in judgment is this very challenging case of the dead versus the living baby. And he demonstrates incredible wisdom, and that report spreads. That's a story you can tell, isn't it? That's a story that would go far and wide, and it did. And he gained great respect in Israel by virtue of this demonstration of wisdom. So again, you couldn't say that God providentially brought this situation before him very immediately early in his reign. I think there'd be reason to guess it, but you can't prove providence, but there'd be reason to guess that. Any thoughts or comments? Tina?
Solomon asked God for wisdom, and God granted that request. James tells us the same thing. You know, we need to pray for wisdom to understand. We're not going to be in the situation Solomon's in, most likely, but pray that we can understand God's word and know how to rightly apply it, and that needs to be something that we pray for earnestly as well.
Really good, Tina. Tina is referencing James chapter 1, verse 5. In James chapter 1, verse 5, it says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. So I think that's a neat tie-in that Tina makes between what Solomon did and what we should do. And we're not going to be kings over great nations, but we still need wisdom to do God's will in our life and to be effective in the things he has for us to do. And so what do you pray for? I pray for my health. I pray for my financial well-being. I pray for, maybe what should be before all of that would be pray for wisdom in doing God's will. That's what Solomon did, and he praised for it. So good point, Tina. I think a good point. We should pray for wisdom in it, and it needs to be high up on our praying priority list. All right. What was the next question, 3, what was the size of Solomon's army? Well, he had a sizable army. Look at chapter 4, verse 20. Chapter 4, verse 20. Judah and Israel were many as the sand which is by the sea, in multitude, eating and drinking, making merry. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines, unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. And Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour and 80 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 oxen out of the pastures, 100 sheep, besides harts and roebucks, fallow deer, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tipshah unto Azah, over all the kings on this side of the river. He had peace on all sides round about him. And Judah dwelt safely, every man under his vine, every man under his fig tree, from Dan even unto Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariot, 12,000 horsemen. And those officers provided victuals for King Solomon, and for all that came to King Solomon's table, every man his month, they lacked nothing. So the very extent of his reign would say that he had to have a pretty sizable armed force to keep all of that under submission to his reign. And it even mentions the horses and chariots and horsemen. He had a powerful army. Although the indication is, and as you read in the life of Solomon, you read the life of David, there's a lot of warring and fighting that goes on. You read the kings that followed Solomon, and you read a lot about battles and enemies and so forth. But in the case of Solomon, it says specifically that there was a time of real peace. And you don't read about Solomon being a mighty warrior or great military conquest that took place during Solomon's reign. So he had a sizable army, but it didn't seem like he had to use it much. The presence of it, no doubt, was valuable, just a deterrent against anybody who might attack him. But the use of it, fairly unneeded in his time. Skip over to chapter 10, verse 24. I'm not sure that's the one I want. I had something written down there, but no, 26. Chapter 10, verse 26. Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen, whom he bestowed in the cities for chariots and with the king at Jerusalem. And so those cities notice it mentions cities for chariots. And so he had some outposts around his kingdom where he had stationed these military forces. And of course in the capital of Jerusalem he did too. But he had, again, a sizable army.
That next verse 27 is amazing. Verse 2 about the silver.
Yeah. Yeah, hang on to that because I want to talk about that in a minute when we talk about his wealth here in a minute. Okay, next question. How many laborers worked on the temple? We know, of course, what Solomon's famous for is the first temple in Jerusalem. So Solomon constructed that temple. It got torn down when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem. When the exiles came back from Babylonian captivity, they built another one. But it was so inadequate by comparison that the very old people who could remember the old one and now remember the one that they had just reconstructed, they wept because by comparison the one they rebuilt was totally insignificant. Then in the 1st century BC, Herod the Great, on the same site, I don't know whether you should officially call it another temple or just a redoing of the temple, but they usually refer to 3 temples. Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's temple, and then the one that Herod the Great built in Jerusalem. And it was pretty elaborate, but again, didn't compare to Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was, I don't even know what kind of words we would use. Solomon's temple was outrageously elaborate, especially in regards to the way it was ordained with gold and precious things. Just amazing. Look in chapter 5 at verse 13. Chapter 5 at verse 13. King Solomon raised a levy out of all Israel, and the levy was 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month by courses. A month they were in Lebanon and 2 months at home. And Adoniram was over the levy. And Solomon had 70,000 that bear burdens, and 80,000 hewers in the mountains. Beside the chief of Solomon's officers, which were over the work, 3,300, which ruled over the people that wrought in the work. So, I mean, that's a pretty sizable workforce. So if I've written this down right, 30,000 woodcutters, 70,000 burden bearers, 80,000 stone cutters. So that's like 180,000 workers. And there were 3,300, I guess what you'd call job bosses or supervisors over that. 180,000 workers on one building. You know, and when you look at we won't take time to do that, but if you look at the physical dimensions of the temple, the physical dimensions of the temple weren't that incredibly large. Of course, it had a great courtyard around it, but even at that, 180,000 men working on it with 3,300 supervisors over all those men. Now, even at that, it took a good while to finish the work. Look in chapter 6, verse 1. It came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Okay, so get that. The 4th year, 2nd month of his reign. All right, now, go to the end of the chapter, verse 38, 6:38. In the 11th year, in the month Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, and according to all the fashion of it. So was it he 7 years in the building of it. And so from the 4th year, 2nd month, to the 11th year, 8th month, well, it was 7 years, actually a little over 7 years, one about 7.5 years probably, if you're going to look at it that way. Think about that. Again, it wasn't that elaborate. I mean, it was a very elaborate building, but it wasn't that large of a building. But with all the detail work that went into it, it was a massive construction job, lots of people involved in it, and it took, looks like a little over 7 years to build it. What was unique? I asked the question there, what was unique about it? Chapter 6, verse 7. Chapter 6, verse 7, and the house, when it was building, it's talking about the temple, was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in the building. Isn't that pretty incredible? You know, we like to think that we're pretty sophisticated in the things that we're able to accomplish. And obviously we've got the advantage of all kinds of things that Solomon never would have had in that time. But even at that, even with what we would regard as fairly crude tools and mechanical abilities, they hewed the stones, I guess we would say they quarried them out. But before they ever brought them to the site where the temple was being constructed, they had them so measured and so well hewn that the stones fit together. They didn't have to chisel them or beat on them or anything else to make it fit together. I guess this was the original prefab house, if you will. It was made to fit when it got there. I think that's pretty incredible. Because you know, if you were assigned a job like that, you would of course immediately begin thinking about what kind of tools you'd want to acquire to get this job done, and it'd be considerable. Of course, this is all mainly human strength and willpower that got this done, but it was amazing. They didn't even have to use any special tools at the site. Tom? Yeah.
To go with it. Not only you know, there's some hints to it because the way he did his laborers, he took and divided them up. They went up for a month at a time and they had 2 months off.
Yeah.
In that aspect of it. But even those stones, they had to be cut, measured, set aside, numbered, so that they went into the project in the right time, right order, and assembled in the right way.
Exactly.
And people weren't stepping all over themselves, and you see, it's sort of like the ants, when they're going in, they're marching in, they're doing their task until each one is on.
As you said, I think your point's well taken, that this would be a big job management task, making sure, in our day, and some of you guys who maybe Matt, and Bob, what do they call it? On-time delivery. So you're working in the plant, and you don't want to have parts stacked all around you where you can't do your job. And so the suppliers know when to have the parts there just at the right time. And that takes a good bit of planning, on-time delivery. Well, that's what they were doing back in Solomon's day, right? Don't bring me that block number 280. That's not the one I need right now. The one I need is 207. Where's 207 anyway? Bring me block 207. I got to get that in here. Apparently, all of that was worked out, and they were able to accomplish it. Pretty amazing. Sarah?
Interesting, the difference in manpower. You look at in John 2:20, where Jesus is talking about who tear down the temple and build it, and they said it took 46 years to build this temple.
Yeah.
Compared to 7 to build this one frame.
That's good. I hadn't even thought of that comparison, but this was far better than Herod's temple, and yet they did it in less time. Good point. Question 6, how long did it take to build Solomon's own personal dwelling? I thought that was kind of an interesting contrast. I don't know whether we make any point about it or not, but in chapter 7, verse 1, but Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. I don't know if you can make a point about that or not. You know, I've heard people try to make the point, well, they only took 7.5 years to build the temple, and they took 13 years to build Solomon's house. Solomon must think more of himself than he thinks of God. I don't think you could draw that conclusion because you don't know how many men were working on Solomon's house, John.
He may not have had 180,000 men working on his own house.
That's right. So a little hard to make that comparison. But again, a 13-year building project for his own personal house would indicate that it was probably quite elaborate as well. Of course, a famous episode is in chapter 10. Look in chapter 10. We ask who came to Jerusalem to investigate Solomon's fame. Chapter 10, 1 Kings chapter 10, when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. And Solomon told her all her questions. There was not anything hid from the king which he told her not. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all of Solomon's wisdom and the house that he had built, and the meat at his table, and the sitting of his servants, and the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up unto the throne of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, it was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts and of thy wisdom. Howbeit I believed not the words until I came, and my eyes had seen it, and behold, the half was not told me. Thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard. That's a famous episode. The Queen of Sheba said, I'm going to go see for myself because I absolutely do not believe what I'm hearing about Solomon. It cannot be so that a king is that wealthy or that wise. I've got to go see for myself. So she went. And when she went, she said, as incredible as the reports coming to me were, they didn't even tell half the story. The half was not told. It was way more than even what had been. I didn't believe what they were telling me, but when I got here and saw it for myself, the reality is even more than what they were telling me. I didn't believe what they were telling me, and the reality was even greater than that. Sort of a famous declaration of how great Solomon was comes from the Queen of Sheba who came to see him. Yes.
It's kind of the opposite of the way most stories go. You hear all these stories about the people living in the old Wild West and stuff. All of these things are greatly elaborated. If you actually met the person that's telling all these stories about, you probably wouldn't be impressed with them at all.
Yeah.
But these stories just grew and grew and grew to greater and greater grandeur. But this was just the opposite.
Yeah.
His true wisdom, things that God had granted to him, was so much more than even people would tell.
I think exactly right, because by exaggeration, stories are usually over-exaggerated. And so I think that's probably what the Queen of Sheba thought. It's just a big exaggeration. It couldn't possibly be that much. When she got there, she said the half has not been told. Anybody else? All right, now an interesting one. You guys may have to help me. You kids break out your calculators. And I tried to calculate this even this morning, but I think I've messed up my decimal points here. From chapter 10, give a description of Solomon's wealth. All right, at chapter 10, verse 14, the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Okay. Now, there's always some quibbling about how much was a talent, but a pretty good average consideration based upon all of the speculation. 75 pounds. A talent was 75 pounds. Our English measure, 75 pounds. All right, now, a pound, so an ounce of gold, here's your first number. An ounce of gold, as of today, is selling for $1,825, $1,825 is the price of an ounce of gold. That's a troy ounce. There's 12 troy ounces in a pound. So 1,825 times 12 is the value of 1 pound of gold. Anybody got that number?
23,725.
What is it?
23,725.
No, so about almost $24,000 for a pound. Now there's 75 pounds in a talent. So multiply that by 75.
1.779375.
Okay, I had that. That's so about 1.7 million for a talent of gold. Now multiply that by 666. It's going to error out your calculator, isn't it?
It's a lot.
So 1.7 million. Do that, Monty. 1.7 times. Do 1.7 times 666. So 1,000 what? 1,132 millions. So that's a billion, right? That would be a one, and I think that's what I had. I had 1 point. Anybody? Are we missing a decimal point, Sarah?
Oh, I was going to agree with you that I was looking it up, and it said that this would be about 25 tons of gold.
Yeah.
And if you look it up today, it would be about 1.6 billion.
Yeah. So I guess my decimal points were close. Now, that's not his total wealth. That's just the measure of gold that came to him in 1 year. In just 1 year, this would be the measure of gold. He was getting lots of other precious things too. And so he was incredibly wealthy. Now, to the point that Gordon was making earlier, in chapter 10, verse 21, all of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of his house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon. Don't give us that lousy silver. We don't want any of that stuff. And then verse 27, and the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar made he to be as the sycamore trees that are in the vale for abundance. Yeah, silver was like roadside gravel. It would just they didn't even hardly count it. It wasn't significant. Incredibly wealthy. Again, now as we were saying earlier, it's really hard, I think, to make the connection. What's Jeff Bezos? Now he is considered to be the richest man in the world. I heard that in 2020, because of the pandemic, that his personal wealth had increased over 60 billion in 1 year. I think is he worth 350 billion, something like that? It's something like that. It's crazy. It's just an insane amount of money. Makes me want to stop buying at Amazon, although it's just so convenient. But he's very wealthy. But I really don't think that he holds a candle to Solomon's wealth. All right. How many wives did Solomon have? Okay, here's the heartbreak part of the story, right? Chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 1. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said to the children of Israel, Ye shall not go in to them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. So for Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Even, verse 7, did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, that is in the hill before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. Likewise did he for all of the strange wives which burn incense and sacrificed unto their God. That Molech, that's the one we usually point out. the abomination of the Ammonites, Molech. Molech was famously the one that they offered their living babies to in sacrifice. Incredibly horrible what Solomon did at the end of his life. And, you know, the question always comes up, did Solomon repent of that? Did he come back before his death? Did he get right with God? And we'll talk more about that in our study of Ecclesiastes, because Solomon is battling through all of this as we'll study in the book of Ecclesiastes. And when you read the last verses of the book of Ecclesiastes, you have to think that maybe he got his senses back about him before he died. We'll talk more about that. But he certainly went way off the rails here in regards to these idolatrous gods of his foreign wives. He did what he was told not to. And the Israelites, all of the Israelites, not just the kings of Israel, but all of the Israelites were commanded in the law of Moses not to marry from other nations, for the very reason being, you marry those idolatrous persons and they will lead you into their idolatry. And so he was sinning in the process of taking all these wives and concubines. Josh?
You think that a man that God gave such great wisdom to would be able to see that this would not work out with him?
Yeah. Now, that was going to be my next question, in fact. How do we harmonize what we said earlier, that he was wise like none who would ever come before him or after him? He had this great wisdom from God, and then he did this. Josh?
I think it's going to show that God does give us free choice. He doesn't make us do one thing or another. He gives us the freedom of choice to follow his word or not.
Exactly right. I think that's the key. That's the key element. The key answer to the question is, God gave him wisdom, but he did not make him a robot. He gave him the wisdom, but he left him, as we often use the phrase, a free moral agent. He could still make choices, and he made bad choices. Obviously, bad choices. Monty?
The problem, I think, is he was wise. God told him to be wise. He knew he was wise, and he depended too much on his own wisdom and not enough on God's. Expected, he felt like, well, I know this is what the law says. We're not supposed to marry these foreign women. They'll lead us away. But I'm extra sharp, and I can handle it.
Yeah.
And I think we tend to do that a lot today ourselves. If we're not really careful on various and assorted things. We'll think, well, I know that's a downfall for other people, but it won't affect me. We hear that, people get into drinking or drugs and all sorts of things. And they say that, you hear them say, well, I know other people struggle with that, but it's not, I'm better than that, it's not going to affect me. And that's sort of like famous last words. I think when we look at Solomon, maybe part of the problem is that even from the very beginning, though, in chapter 3 and verse 3, it says, Solomon loved the Lord, walked in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. So even from the beginning of Solomon's reign, he wasn't doing everything the way it was supposed to be done, or it wouldn't have made that statement about that exception there.
Yeah.
And so he struggled all the way through with being completely faithful to God, and then we see it says at the end of his life, these foreign women turned him away. So we've got to be really careful ourselves. I think even though I wouldn't necessarily say it was a sin to marry someone that was a non-Christian, it didn't work out good for Solomon, and he had wisdom from God that we don't have. So
I think that's the point. I think that's the point our young people need. We need to stress that to you, because I've known young people who said, well, I'm going to marry this person and they're not a Christian, and I know that there could be some problems that come up because they don't have the same faith I have. They don't believe like I believe, but I think I can handle it. I love this person, and I think that we'll be able to work through that. I think I can handle it. I don't know, one time I was talking to a young man, and he was ready, I think probably already engaged, but ready to marry a young woman who was not a member of the Lord's church. In fact, she was a pretty strong member of a denominational group, but he was going to marry her. And he was talking to me about it, and so I knew the guy well, and I felt I could be blunt with him, so I just said to him, so you think you're smarter than Solomon, I guess? Well, he stood up like that. Well, he said, I never thought about it that way. And to his credit, he didn't get mad at me over it. And to his credit, he broke it off with that girl and did not marry her. And you know, that's really something for you young folks to think about as you're seeking a mate. You know, you think you're smarter than Solomon, that you can date this person, fall in love with this person, ultimately marry this person who doesn't believe what you believe, and you think that won't be a problem? You think you're wiser than Solomon? You got to ask yourself that. I mean, in all honesty, you got to ask yourself that question. All right. Well, our time is just up. Thanks for all the good comments. Lord willing, now for those in this class, we'll take the first lesson. We'll dive into chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes starting next Sunday. Thanks, everybody.